Today on Calm Historian, we explore how one quiet reason resistance inside Germany stayed so small was the Allies' refusal to support the men and women who stood against Hitler. Yet many still plotted, printed, and whispered in the dark, hoping to overthrow the regime and shorten the war. Comment with your location and your current local time. If this calm look into the past resonates, please like and subscribe. When people point to why German resistance to Nazism failed, they usually name calculations, betrayals, fear, and ideology. Underneath those dry explanations, though, there is a quieter, sharper grief. The Western Allies refused to give their weight to the men and women inside Germany who, at enormous risk, were trying to stop the ruin from within. It was a bitter paradox. Courage lived in small, private places, in churches, in hushed kitchen table conversations, in the steely resolve of officers and diplomats who would not bow to the evil around them. And yet the great powers, bound by policy and principle, insisted on unconditional surrender. That rigid stance hardened the choices people faced. Many Germans recoiled from action because they could not imagine endorsing anything that might invite the total destruction of the country they loved, however much they hated the regime that ruled it. Courage, however, does not always follow doctrine. Against the grain of despair and legal caution, a scattering of people kept going. They were not generals or public figures. They were mid-level officials, diplomats, clerks, wives, students, and priests. Ordinary people performing small acts of defiance to save lives or tilt fate. One of them was Fritz Kolbe, a name few outside specialist circles would have recognized at the time. He was not a celebrated leader of a resistance movement. In the maze of the German Foreign Ministry, he was a mid-level official, someone whose days were soaked in files, dispatches, and the slow routine of diplomacy. Yet what he chose to do in those corridors altered how American intelligence understood the inner workings of the Third Reich. Kolbe's choice came down to silence and papers. For 3 years he carried out a perilous, methodical task, getting top-secret documents out of Berlin and into American hands via neutral Switzerland. He brought with him not just the ink and seal of officialdom, but a conscience burning at the center of his life. The story of that 3-year strain, the furtive meetings, the weighty envelopes, the narrow gambles against discovery, is the spine of Lucas de Latre's A Spy at the Heart of the Third Reich. De Latre, a French journalist, pieces together how a relatively unassuming man became, in the eyes of the Americans who received his reports, their most valuable agent inside Nazi Germany. Berlin in those years was a city split between grand facades and the smoke and fear that softened them, corridors where civil servants shuffled papers while the world outside convulsed. Kolbe knew how to move in those spaces. He had an ear for the tone of a cable and an eye for the single line that carried danger or exposed a plan. He gathered those details and sent them west along routes that took advantage of Switzerland's neutrality, through Bern to the Americans. There, officers unpacked his cargo and turned it into action. Each packet of intelligence was a small, precise blow against a vast, brutal machine. Each successful transmission cleared a little of the secrecy the Nazis depended on. There was nothing cinematic about his work, no staged rendezvous or theatrical cloak and dagger. His bravery was quiet, ordinary, and utterly dangerous. Every document he smuggled, every scrap of news that left Berlin bound for Bern, carried the threat of discovery, imprisonment, or worse. Still he kept going, driven by a principle that most people were unwilling to carry once the Allied demand for unconditional surrender cast long shadows over any conspiratorial hope. Where many Germans saw only that shadow and stepped back, Kolbe stepped forward, even though the help his country needed would have to come from foreign capitals. Delattra's account makes those choices feel immediate and urgent, not just moves on an intelligence map, but moral reckonings. It traces how a man embedded in the machinery of power decided that loyalty to his country required betraying its government. It follows a Clark through 3 years of tireless, secret labor until, in American eyes, he had become their most vital asset inside a collapsing Reich. The book asks us to live the suspense of every crossing, to hear the hush of the rooms where documents changed hands, and to sense the lonely exhilaration of a man who risked everything to make sure truth could get out of the dark and into the hands that could use it. Fritz Kolbe was only 5'7", yet there was a larger presence about him than his height suggested. He moved with a compact steadiness, lean and wiry, the kind of man who took pleasure in pushing his body and savored the small victories of stamina and skill. You could see it in the taut shoulders of a man who rose before dawn to run or row, in the quick, economical gestures of someone who valued precision and endurance. For him, sport wasn't a casual pastime. It was a habit that shaped his days and kept his nerves steady. People noticed the briskness of his walk, the careful rhythm of his breath, the readiness to test himself against weather and distance, and you could easily imagine him on a cold morning, fists gloved, breath steaming, driving himself along a riverbank, and finding in that exertion a clear sort of moral focus. In social rooms and diplomatic offices, he was relentlessly charming without ever trying too hard. His manners were polished but never showy, his smile quick, his gaze attentive. Women noticed him because he listened and remembered small details, offering himself with a refreshing lack of pretension. He could be the perfect companion for a rainy afternoon, telling stories with easy wit, moving through conversation with a graceful sense of timing and the subtle skill of giving praise where it was due. Calling him a ladies' man wasn't meant to belittle him so much as to recognize a genuine emotional intelligence and warmth. He enjoyed company and the gentler pleasures of life, and he belonged in the soft theater of social exchange. At the same time, Kolbe had little taste for public glory. His ambitions never reached for grand political power or loud fame. They were modest and focused on the steady demands of a career in the foreign ministry. He took satisfaction in the order of bureaucracy, the careful filing of reports, the low hum of confidential correspondence, the small pleasures of competence and discretion. There was an old-world dignity to his work. Crisp telegrams, measured replies, the patient influence of someone who preferred to make a difference quietly from behind a desk. He was content to let the world surge around him, while he remained a dependable part of the machinery of statecraft. Then 1933 arrived, and everything familiar shifted. After Hitler came to power, Germany began to harden and darken in ways that wounded him at the core. The casual comforts of office life and social pleasure suddenly felt insufficient. The daily rhythms that had once soothed him now rang hollow against the new noise of fanaticism. As the political landscape tightened and the air grew thick with propaganda and coercion, Colby felt a slow change unfolding inside him. The discipline that had driven his athletic life turned inward. The man who'd been satisfied with a small sphere of influence discovered that his conscience would not be contained. What grew in him was not a desire for revenge or a sudden political zeal, but a single, compelling aim: to use whatever power he had to overturn the Nazi regime. That resolve began quietly and then gathered force, a moral and practical determination that would come to define him. In that quiet conversion, the night lines of his former life blurred, and his modest ambitions at the Foreign Ministry became the platform for a very different duty. Fritz Colby, the 5'7" sportsman and charming companion, had found in his country's crisis the deepest purpose he had yet known: to resist, by every means he could, the darkness sweeping over Germany. Colby was reckless and outspoken. He wrote anti-Nazi leaflets, talked with friends about sabotage, and indulged fantasies of a people's militia. Somehow the Gestapo never came for him. Others in his circle were arrested and punished, but Colby slipped through. That was its own burden. They were risking their lives and accomplishing little of consequence. At last, he settled on what he judged the most effective way to hurt the Third Reich: to deliver its secrets to the Allies. Treason? So be it, he told himself at a moment that can't be pinned down exactly, probably in the late months of 1942 or the early part of 1943. There are objects that seem to breathe on their own: a book that feels heavy in your hands, a paper identity card softened and creased at the corners, a photograph that smells like the room it came from. Folded together in memory, here are two such things: one deliberate and recent, the other a quiet witness from a darker, earlier time. In 2005, Lucas Delattre published a book whose title reads like both a promise and a dare: A Spy at the Heart of the Third Reich, the extraordinary story of Fritz Kolbe, America's most important spy in World War II. It runs 321 pages and lives on a shelf as the kind of book someone reaches for when they want to see how one life can ripple outward. Critics and readers have often greeted Delatre's work with high praise, the sort of admiration condensed into 5-star ratings. And it's easy to understand why. His narrative isn't just a ledger of dates and cables. It tries to bring a human voice into the closed rooms and hush-hush offices where weighty decisions were made. Opening the book is like stepping into the hum of a world where ordinary things, a diplomatic cover, a typed memo, an identity card, could mask consequences far beyond themselves. Among the relics that remain from that world is a Spanish identity card that once belonged to Fritz Colby. It's modest to the point of humility, a small rectangle of paper or thin card, the edges softened by decades, though by the ink rubbed away where fingers handled it most. For a man who would later be named by historians and intelligence officers as one of the war's most consequential figures, the card feels intimately ordinary. It dates to the mid-1930s, when Kolbe served as a consular official at the German embassy in Madrid, a posting amid Spain's unrest and the tense rumblings across Europe that helped shape the choices he would make. The card itself, Spanish lettering, official stamps, and a shorthand certifying identity and status, carries both the blunt authority of bureaucracy and the quieter trace of the person who kept it. If you look closely, you can almost see how it was used, folded into a pocket, held up at checkpoints, laid on a desk between formal conversations. In modern reproductions, the piece is often shown as a single frame with a caption. ID card of Fritz Kolbe, the top American spy in World War II, and an online source line that credits Alcatron. That kind of attribution is now part of how history moves. A scan, a caption, a shared image that lets us look back and put the pieces together. Set the card beside Delatre's book, and the contrast becomes almost theatrical. The unassuming paper of a mid-1930s consular identity lying next to a 2005 account, trying to make sense of the life that carried it. Both are forms of testimony. One was issued by a foreign administration to grant passage and recognition. The other is a crafted telling. Digits and ink turned into narrative as documents, memories, and context are gathered into a portrait. They belong to the same story but serve different kinds of proof. The quiet, persistent evidence of presence and the later patient work of shaping a life into history. Together they ask the listener to lean in and listen to the timbre of those years, to follow the narrow trail from a small card in Madrid out to the wide sweep of wartime consequence. Kolbe lived by one hard rule. He would not work with the Soviet Union. He had watched communism spread across Europe and hardened against it, and that certainty shaped every risky choice he made. When he decided to place his trust in the Western democracies, it was not a casual move, but the last, deliberate gamble of a man who knew what was at stake. His first stop was London. He walked into rooms where lamplight pooled on polished wood, and officers in crisp uniforms spoke in low, clipped tones. He laid a bundle of papers on the table, documents handled in haste, edges softened by repeated folding, ink still fresh with importance, and watched the men across from him for the small signs that turned strangers into allies. A flicker of recognition, a throat clearing, an instant calculation. Instead he met suspicion. MI6, trained to spot deception after years of double agents and elaborate tricks, closed ranks. To them the urgency in his voice, the guarded answers, the stack of top-secret material read less like an ally's offer than a carefully set trap. Someone let the word Abwehr slip into the room, and that single, icy accusation sealed their decision. They turned him down without ceremony. The refusal hit him hard. He left London with the bundle pressed to his chest, every step weighted by what he had failed to place where it might do the most good. For many, that kind of setback would have meant retreat. For Kolbe, it only sharpened his resolve. He moved through a Europe that felt tighter every day, checkpoints, curfews, eyes everywhere, and spent weeks piecing together a new route. He relied on favors owed, on sympathizers, on intermediaries who could carry messages through the underground language wartime had created. Each handoff had to be timed, every meeting arranged to slip past the watchful gaze of occupation forces and casual informers. Gradually, a path formed toward the Americans. The United States was across an ocean, but its agents were scattered in safe houses, embassies, and neutral cities, and Kolbe set about mapping a course to them with the stubborn patience of someone working by lamplight. By a chain of discreet arrangements and whispered referrals, he was guided into the orbit of the American mission in Switzerland. Bern, with its old stone streets and neutral calm, felt both like sanctuary and a stage where clandestine dramas were played out beneath a polite surface. There he was directed to Alan Dulles, who ran the OSS station. Dulles carried the bearing of a former corporate lawyer, polished, precise, and capable of the cold calculation espionage demanded. Their first meeting offered little warmth and a great deal of appraisal. Dulles listened the way a man trained to weigh every syllable listens, treating the papers with the cool, methodical scrutiny of someone who measures risk like currency. He did not leap. He examined. What Colby produced could not be brushed off. The documents bore the marks of authenticity, careful notation, sensitive details that a fabricator would struggle to invent. And they settled on the table with the undeniable weight of truth. As Dulles worked through them, his expression changed, not into sudden belief, but into the steadier look of a professional who recognizes opportunity and knows the price of ignoring it. Kolbe spoke without drama, only a steady, earnest insistence. He offered not a story to be admired, but the means to act. Ultimately, it came down to that combination. The papers were too sensitive to dismiss outright, and the man who brought them would not fit easily into the familiar boxes of deceit. Colby's quiet conviction lent his case a clarity that could not be ignored. After a long, considered pause, Dulles chose to move forward, a moment where meticulous caution gave way to a risky decision that would change the course of clandestine work in wartime Europe, because one man refused to be silenced, and another, despite training and suspicion, decided to listen. He moved through the Foreign Office like a man walking past the shattered pieces of a belief he'd once trusted. Fritz Kolbe had not been born a traitor. He had been trained to serve the state, to carry dispatches and handle correspondence with the sure, careful gestures of a diplomat. He knew how to fold an envelope so a crease would not give anything away, how to read the tone of a ciphered cable and sense the temper hiding behind the words. Those small, office-born skills, learned at polished desks and behind closed doors, would be put to work for a cause no one could have taught him in school. His change of heart did not come in a single thunderclap, but as a slow wearing down, a conscience rubbed raw by what he saw day after day. Inside the Foreign Office, the language of policy and protocol smoothed over horrors that could not be reduced to briefs. He watched colleagues take expediency for truth, heard the casual cruelty of offhand orders, and felt a disgust that would not be quieted. The oath he had once believed honorable was hollowed out by a regime that met its own brutality with bureaucratic calm, and that calm became unbearable. So he did something that must have felt like madness. He began to pass on what he knew: cables, reports, lists, the assessments that flowed through the building like a secret river. He smuggled out documents, memoranda, maps that in their dry, official language held the human consequences the regime wanted hidden. This was no glamorous spy story. It was patient, methodical work, often made up on the spot. He copied, memorized, and stashed papers in the folds of his coat, in his satchel, in the ink-stained hands of a man who could no longer take the day's work home and sleep. His meetings were not cinematic confrontations, but tense conversations in neutral houses and hotel rooms, quiet handoffs in the lobbies of foreign legations, contacts with agents working for the Allied cause. The people who listened to him had to turn fragments and riddles into meaning. He became one of their most important sources, a conduit from the heart of the Nazi foreign apparatus to those trying to stop it. The documents he supplied sharpened the Allies' picture of German intentions, exposed networks, pointed to movements, and in some cases helped save lives. What kept him going was not doctrine or strategy, but a simple moral clarity that made every risk a necessity. It cost him more than the fear of being caught. It cost him the ordinary certainties of life in his own country, the trust of colleagues, the comfortable rhythm of routine, the chance to walk without checking over his shoulder. With every packet he handed across, he left a piece of himself, the image of a child whose future he wanted to protect, an adult's refusal to be complicit. He knew the arithmetic of danger, how one mistake could send him to a fate spelled out in the very files he carried, and still he carried on. Espionage, as Colby lived it, was as banal as it was brave. His intelligence rarely arrived wrapped in dramatic headlines. It came as dry diplomatic traffic that another reader might have shrugged off. Lists of names, travel plans, meeting summaries, analyses of priorities. But when those fragments were stitched together, they became a map. They revealed routes and weak spots, helped the Allies decide where pressure would count. From the clutter and euphemism of the Foreign Office, he carved a route to the truth. When the guns fell silent, history did not immediately reward him. The civil servant life he had known was gone, and the post-war world was slow to tell apart those who had served the regime from those who had undermined it from within. Recognition came, when it came, quietly and slowly, less public applause than a hard, late acknowledgement. Still, whatever honors arrived or did not arrive, the fact remained. He had stood on the side of the oppressed rather than the powerful, at enormous personal risk. Colby was, in appearance, an ordinary man doing something extraordinary. He wore no heroic uniform, only the modest suit of a diplomat that allowed him to move through embassies and corridors unnoticed. He blended into crowds, slipped documents into the sleeves of an official world, and let others judge him as they would. Behind that ordinary face, he must have felt the steady drum of fear and sudden flares of conviction. Every step he took was careful and defiant at once. Institutions that remember the German resistance hold his story as more than spycraft. They see it as a moral example, how a single conscience, acting with fierce decency, can complicate a monolith of evil from within. His files and photographs sit in archives like a quiet rebuke to the idea that ordinary institutions are bound to become corrupt. When people pause before his portrait, they're not just looking at a face. They are facing a human decision made under severe moral strain. His life shows that the most consequential choices are often made away from headlines, in dimly lit rooms where one person decides that personal safety will not outweigh the demands of justice. He moved through the machinery of power feeling like a conscience in a machine that had stiffened, and he turned the language of diplomacy into a tool for truth. There is a particular courage in hearing the names on those lists as more than numbers, in knowing the destination of a cable and feeling the weight of responsibility press down. The image preserved at the German Resistance Memorial Center asks us to remember not only what was done, but why. to listen for the quiet, know that resists overwhelming conformity, to recognize the complicated bravery of those who resist with documents and patience, and to hold a slender thread of defiance as proof that one moral act can bend the course of events and keep memory honest. For months they wouldn't believe him. The words settled into the low-lit corridors of wartime intelligence like a quiet verdict, reshaping careers, redirecting trust, and leaving urgent truths suspended between governments. From his post in Bern, Allen Dulles had done everything he could. Steady streams of diplomatic cables, reports born of careful listening and delicate contacts, each dispatch stamped, sealed, and sent up the chain into the hungry, skeptical machinery of Allied counterintelligence. His superiors, seeing what he had risked to learn, passed the packets to the OSS counter-espionage section, where they were opened with the kind of suspicion that comes after years of deception and betrayal. The files did not stay put. They crossed the invisible fault lines between American and British services until, in time, they reached MI6 in London and fell to one particular mind. Lieutenant Colonel Claude Dancy took them apart. He sat at a long table under a single lamp, papers spread in neat rows, a pen ready to mark every inconsistency. He set his staff to work, dates checked against schedules, phrases weighed for provenance, every line read with the cold caution of people who had been burned by false leads before. That fine-toothed scrutiny was not a flourish. It was method, discipline, and a refusal to be fooled by an elegant story. But personal feeling crept in. Dancy, it must be said plainly, detested Allen Dulles, and that dislike was shared across a significant slice of British intelligence. Old rivalries, national slights, professional jealousies made it easy for one opinion to harden into institutional prejudice. Where Dulles saw hard-won intelligence, Dancy and his allies saw, at best, improbable luck, and at worst, an artfully planted deception. Their impulse was to deny the material the benefit of the doubt, and that refusal did not stop at a skeptical memo. It hardened into policy. By late April 1943, the rebuke had crossed the Atlantic. Allen Dulles was told, in words that must have cut, "All news from Bern these days is being discounted 100% by the War Department." Those 6 words condensed months of frustration and disbelief. They marked a moment when channels choked on distrust, when accurate reporting could be set aside by institutional bias, and when suspicion did real, quiet damage. The cables remained what they were, the product of patient work in a neutral city where secrets moved like shadows. But the verdict had already been handed down. For months, in the eyes of those who mattered most, they simply would not believe him. For nearly a year, suspicion inside the OSS and in MI6 kept the Allies from using much of what Kolbe handed over, even though he had spent long stretches inside the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, standing close enough to Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and other top Nazis to overhear conversations that could chill the blood. In the war's closing, chaotic years, when every scrap of intelligence could tip a balance, a single alias moved through the corridors of power with quiet urgency. Delattre, writing with hindsight, boiled that urgency into an astonishing claim. In the last 2 years of the conflict, George Wood, the cover name for an American agent in the heart of Nazi diplomacy, delivered no fewer than 2,600 secret documents taken from Hitler's Foreign Office. Those were not abstract statistics, but a stack of policy memoranda, coded correspondence and the faint incriminating fingerprints of a regime falling apart. Each page was more than paper, a sliver of daylight into enemy decision-making that commanders and analysts could read and act on. Information, in war, is currency, and that steady stream of files changed the Allies' ability to anticipate, to plan, and to counter. The news of it did more than whisper through the war rooms of London and Washington. It landed as a decisive reality. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who bore the burdens and the blame of strategy, put it plainly. He called the man behind the alias, one of the most valuable agents we had during the entire war. Decades later, Richard Helms, a former OSS officer who became CIA director, echoed and amplified that judgment in his memoirs published in April 2003. Colby's information is now recognized as the very best produced by any Allied agent in World War II. Those endorsements do more than praise a single operative. They recast how we understand what intelligence actually did for the Allies. To see Colby simply as a meticulous collector misses what those assessments imply. He embodied risk, turned into advantage, penetrating closed rooms and secret files, and turning hidden communications into usable knowledge. In the improvisational world of wartime intelligence, where contacts could vanish and operations unravel at a moment's notice, Colby's steady, prolific output stands out. 2,600 documents is not a tidy footnote. It is a torrent that reshaped what Allied planners knew and how fast they could move. So when historians and former intelligence chiefs call him the top American spy, they are not indulging in hyperbole, but recognizing a practical fact. His access, the quality of the material and the timing of those deliveries made his work among the most consequential any Allied agent produced. In the quiet ledger of wartime service, his name marks a rare convergence of daring, skill, and consequence. A single operative whose relentless flow of vital information earned him an extraordinary place in the annals of intelligence and in the memories of the men who led the Allied effort. Delattre called him a magician, and even that single line hardly captures the strange, quiet wonder of what Colby did. In a small cluttered room well behind the front lines, papers and maps lay across a table, as if someone had scattered a private constellation. Into that clutter walked information that seemed impossible, folded into ordinary dispatches, routes and cargoes, factories and fleets, the low methodical logistics of a war roaring elsewhere. Delattre did not mean sleight of hand, so much as that same astonished feeling each time Colby produced another detail no one had asked for, and yet which turned out to be exactly what Allied planners needed to see. His revelations arrived in many forms. Often they read like short, bureaucratic intelligence briefs. How the Spanish are delivering tungsten to the Germans, one memo recorded. To a lieutenant studying a map that might have sounded like a minor line item, but Colby's note made it immediate. Tungsten slipping across neutral borders in secret consignments. A hard, dull metal moving like blood to feed an engine of war. It was not an abstract commodity. It was a strategic lifeline. The German armaments industry, Delattre wrote, desperately needed such supplies. Without them, certain hardened steels and precision parts would fail. That single clause could reveal the fragile hinge on which machines and men turned. Other times the facts were the kind that made commanders sit up. Kolbe reported a planned German retreat as far as the Dnieper, a movement that suggested the shape of a new front. He noted German and Japanese submarines off the Cape of Good Hope. Sleek hulls, sliding the dark curve of ocean where merchant convoys had felt safe. He named factories with pinpoint precision. The Telefunken factory in Lichterfelde, near Berlin, which provides precision equipment to the Luftwaffe. To lose that one site was to threaten instruments so central that aircraft and crews would be affected in cascade. What struck people was not only how much Kolbe produced, but how wide his sweep was. He did not stick to high politics or grand troop movements. He moved with equal calm from the shadowed logistics of a neutral port to the quiet manufacture of a radio diaphragm, to the routing of a submarine flotilla. He seemed to know exactly where small things and large met, where a conveyor belt inside a factory could be as decisive as a trench on the line. Delatre's list of strategic revelations, critical plant locations, and streams of materials reads less like a checklist than like a handheld map that gradually exposes the hidden veins of a vast war machine. There is a human intimacy to many of these details that makes them hard to forget. The tungsten was not just metal on paper, but steady convoys of ore and ingots, moved by merchants and engineers who may have thought themselves beyond politics, doing work folded into a larger struggle for survival. The Telefunken plant was a building filled with craftsmen and fine tools, producing instruments that helped bomber crews find their targets and enabled night operations. To identify those things was not merely to name targets. It was to touch the nervous system of an industry and to point to where a surgeon might cut. And yet the record also shows a painful hesitancy. Some of Kolbe's tips were acted on quickly. Others were set aside. Delatre's question hangs there. If the Allies had followed every one of these revelations without delay, might the slow, costly arc of the war have been shortened by months? It is an unanswerable counterfactual, but its force is plain. Where Kolbe's lines of leverage were followed, the enemy's machinery faltered. Where they were ignored, the engines kept turning. Read with Delatre's voice in the files. The magician image feels less fanciful. Kolbe did not conjure rabbits or smoke. He drew from a hidden world a steady stream of precise, practical truths that could change plans, reroute supplies, blunt production. For those charged with stopping the Reich, these were not tricks, but tools. If only the tools had always been used as readily as they were revealed. A face in a small, grainy photograph can do a curious thing. It makes an author feel like a companion. On the book jacket, and now in that little square that announces him on Twitter, Lucas Delatre's portrait quietly invites us to imagine the life behind the byline. There's a calm confidence in that look, the kind that comes from having watched events play out both at a crowded press table and from the measured quiet of an academic office, and that same curious, observant, unmistakably seasoned presence follows the arc of his career, moving between classrooms and foreign desks, between the careful study of the past and the urgent rhythm of contemporary reporting. He began his training in the halls of the École Normale Supérieure, graduating with the class of 1985 after focusing on arts and history. Long lecture rooms, margins full of neat notes, evenings spent pairing the detail of a brushstroke with the sweep of a political movement. That time sharpened not only what he knew, but how he saw stories and placed them in context. He then added a practical layer at ESCP Europe, finishing a master's in media and communication in 1989, and that mix, rigorous humanities work alongside a command of modern media, would shape the precision and range of everything he did next. From 1989 until 1997, he lived the life of a foreign correspondent in Germany for Le Monde. Those years taught him to trust the cadence of language under pressure, to turn complex realities into dispatches that crossed borders cleanly. The correspondent's life is an odd weave of patience and urgency, waiting up late for an interview that finally comes at midnight, then trimming a long account down to the essentials so a reader in Paris can feel the shape of a distant conversation. For 8 years he kept that rhythm, filing reports that bore Le Monde's steady voice while carrying the sharper, lived perspective of someone who had been inside the places he described. He came back to Paris in 1997 and spent the next 4 years on Le Monde's foreign desk, helping to shape the paper's international coverage from the newsroom's center. That work demanded thinking on several calendars at once, reacting to breaking headlines while holding a longer historical frame in view, and his background in arts and history gave him a steady hand. In 2001, he moved into the role of deputy editor at Le Monde des Débats, bringing both the disciplined eye of a veteran journalist and the reflective curiosity of a scholar. A new chapter began in 2002, when he became head of the Paris office of the Council of Europe, a post he kept until 2005. There his journalistic instincts and academic training found a different outlet, managing institutional communications, negotiating the tricky space between policy and public opinion, and making sure messages were shaped with clarity and care. Each responsibility added a new layer to his practice, reinforcing how storytelling and institutions intersect in the public sphere. Since 2006, he has led communications for the Institut Français de la Mode and teaches as a professor of communication, media, and digital. In that role, he brings together everything he learned in lecture halls, foreign bureaus, and European meeting rooms. He doesn't teach theory alone. He teaches a craft lived in the field, guiding students through the same choices a reporter or communications director faces, urging them to pair careful attention with imagination. The little portrait on Twitter is only an invitation. The fuller image is of a life spent listening, analyzing, and communicating, a life that lets him write a biography with the kind of insight that comes from watching history and the telling of it unfold from many angles.